The North Atlantic, February 1942. The ocean is a sprawling graveyard of gray swells and freezing foam. Through the salt-streaked lens of a U-boat periscope, a German commander observes a bizarre silhouette lumbering across the horizon. It is not the sleek, riveted profile of a traditional British freighter. It is blunt. It is entirely ungraceful. It is a floating steel box. Back in Berlin, naval architects of the Kriegsmarine pored over intercepted blueprints of these new American cargo vessels. They looked at the boxy dimensions, the revolutionary welded seams, and the slow 11-knot top speed. They dismissed the design as crude and amateurish. To the precision-obsessed engineers of the Third Reich, these ships were structurally doomed, designed by a nation that seemingly knew nothing of the sea. They laughed at the sheer audacity of launching such ugly, fragile targets into submarine-infested waters. It was a moment of supreme, fatal arrogance. The German High Command believed their torpedoes would easily outpace American shipyards, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the raw, awakening power of an entirely new kind of industrial war machine. The late autumn of 1940 brings a dark, freezing reality to the North Atlantic. Following the fall of France, Admiral Karl Dönitz and his U-boat fleet gain a devastating geographic advantage. Submarine pens constructed of massive reinforced concrete sprout along the French coastline at Lorient-Saint-Nazaire, granting German crews direct access to the open ocean. They no longer have to navigate the perilous journey around the British Isles. The waters stretching from the coast of Ireland to the eastern seaboard of North America become an active slaughterhouse. This period becomes known to the German submarine commanders as the First Happy Time. Operating in deadly wolf packs, they strike under the cover of darkness, silhouetting slow-moving merchant convoys against the moonlight. The ocean surface burns with spilled oil. The night air echoes with the deafening sound of tearing metal, and the desperate distress calls of sinking freighters. Britain is an island fortress, but an island cannot feed itself, nor can it fuel a modern mechanized war. Before the outbreak of hostilities, the United Kingdom required roughly 50 million tons of imported food, petroleum, and raw materials annually just to maintain its baseline economy. Now the arteries of the British Empire are being systematically severed. The mathematics of starvation are cold, absolute, and utterly terrifying. By the spring of 1941, Axis submarines, surface raiders, and aircraft are sending hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the ocean every single month. Britain is losing cargo vessels 3 times faster than her battered, overstretched shipyards can replace them. It is a simple, lethal equation. If the line on the graph representing sunken tonnage continues to outpace the line representing newly built tonnage, the war will end not with a decisive battlefield defeat, but with a silent, starving surrender. The traditional method of British shipbuilding cannot solve this crisis. Naval architecture in the early 20th century is largely treated as a heavy industrial art form. Ships are designed with elegant, customized lines, built to ply the seas for decades. They are assembled using millions of individual steel rivets. The process is incredibly labor-intensive. A skilled 4-man riveting squad must heat iron rivets in a portable forge until they glow cherry red. Toss them precisely to a catcher. Insert them into drilled holes and hammer them flush before they cool to form a watertight seal. It is a slow, methodical, physically exhausting process. Under normal conditions, a single standard cargo ship takes 8 to 9 months to complete. Furthermore, these shipyards are actively burning. The Luftwaffe relentlessly bombs the vital industrial centers on the Clyde, the Tyne, and in Belfast. British shipwrights work under blackout conditions, exhausted, constantly interrupted by wailing air raid sirens and the concussion of high explosives. They physically cannot match the pace of the destruction unfolding in the Atlantic. Prime Minister Winston Churchill understands this grim arithmetic better than anyone in his war cabinet. He would later confess that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire conflict was the U-boat peril. The survival of the United Kingdom does not depend on fighter planes or ground troops. It depends entirely on cargo capacity. Without merchant ships, the factories grind to a halt. The Royal Air Force has no aviation fuel. The Army has no ammunition. In utter desperation, Britain turns its eyes westward, across the very ocean that is swallowing its merchant marine. A British shipbuilding mission arrives in the United States in late 1940. They bring with them the blueprints for a reliable, older-style tramp steamer, the Ocean class. It is a simple, coal-burning cargo ship capable of carrying roughly 10,000 tons of dead weight. The British begged the Americans to build 60 of these vessels immediately. But the United States, still technically neutral, is already straining its own maritime infrastructure to build complex, modern warships for a potential two-ocean conflict. The established American shipbuilding industry is operating at maximum capacity. There are no empty slipways, and there is no surplus of highly skilled shipwrights trained in the complex art of riveting. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognizes the existential threat facing the Allies. The arsenal of democracy must be activated, but its weapons are useless if the delivery vehicles are resting on the ocean floor. A radical, unprecedented solution is required. The British blueprint must be stripped down, heavily modified, and reimagined not as a traditional seafaring vessel, but as a mass-produced industrial commodity. The challenge demands a complete abandonment of conventional naval architecture, setting the stage for an industrial revolution on the waterfront. In the spring of 1941, the United States Maritime Commission faces an impossible mandate. They must build a bridge of ships across the Atlantic, and they must do it faster than German torpedoes can sink them. The established shipyards of the eastern seaboard are already choked to capacity, fulfilling massive naval contracts for destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. There is no physical space left to build merchant vessels. To achieve this logistical miracle, the American government turns not to a seasoned naval architect, but to an industrialist who has never built a ship in his life. His name is Henry J. Kaiser. He is a massive, relentless force of nature, a high-stakes contractor famous for pouring millions of tons of concrete at the Hoover and Grand Coulee dams. Kaiser looks at a coastal shipyard and sees something completely different from the traditional shipwrights. Where they see a bespoke artisanal craft requiring years of apprenticeship, Kaiser sees a simple assembly line. He believes that if you can mass-produce automobiles in Detroit, you can mass-produce 10,000-ton cargo freighters on the Pacific coast. The British Ocean-class design is handed over to the firm of Gibbs & Cox in New York for a radical utilitarian redesign. The mandate is brutal in its simplicity. Prioritize sheer speed of construction, absolute standardization, and maximum cargo capacity. Aesthetics, crew comfort, and traditional maritime elegance are entirely discarded. The resulting blueprint is officially designated the EC2SC1. The E stands for emergency, the C for cargo, and the 2 indicates a large seagoing vessel between 400 and 450 feet in length. This new design is strikingly utilitarian. The graceful raked bow of a traditional merchantman is replaced with a blunt, plumb stem to simplify the steel plating. The complex curved lines of the hull are flattened out, transforming the vessel into a massive rectangular steel box with a prow. It measures exactly 441 feet and 6 inches long. It spans 57 feet across the beam. Deep within its cavernous belly, it can swallow an astonishing amount of war material. A single EC2SC-1 can transport 300 railway cars, or 2,000, and 800 jeeps, or 440 light tanks. Alternatively, it can carry enough rations to feed an entire army division for months. President Roosevelt Upon seeing the initial schematics, famously refers to it as a dreadful-looking object. Time magazine bluntly dubs it an ugly duckling. But beauty is completely irrelevant in a war of attrition. The EC-2SK-1 is designed to be a beast of burden, a disposable workhorse meant to cross the Atlantic just once if necessary to deliver its payload. To improve public perception, the Maritime Commission officially rebrands them as Liberty ships. To power this massive box, the designers make a controversial but highly pragmatic choice. They install an antiquated 2,500 horsepower triple expansion steam engine. Modern steam turbines are vastly superior and much faster, but they require precision gear cutting machines that the American industrial base cannot immediately supply in high volumes. The older, heavy steam engines, however, can be built by dozens of factories across the country that previously manufactured rail locomotives or heavy machinery. The massive engine pushes the fully loaded Liberty ship at a top speed of only 11 knots. It is agonizingly slow, but it is reliable, simple to maintain at sea, and exactly what the factories can produce by the hundreds. To build these vessels, Kaiser and the Maritime Commission do not expand existing facilities. They construct entirely new shipyards from scratch on empty mudflats in California, Oregon, and Washington state. They build colossal manufacturing plants with massive fabrication sheds. The old method of laying a keel and building a ship piece by piece on the slipway is thrown out. Instead, they adopt a revolutionary technique called prefabrication. Steel plates are cut and shaped miles inland. Entire sections of the ship, the deckhouse, the bulkheads, the massive bow assembly, are built upside down in the sheds to make the welding faster and easier. These enormous chunks of steel are then loaded onto specialized flatbed railcars, rolled out to the waterfront, and hoisted into place by towering cranes. The slipway is no longer a construction site. It is merely a final assembly point. This modular approach shatters every established maritime tradition, setting the foundation for a radical new method of shipbuilding that forces both engineers and the enemy to rethink the very nature of industrial warfare. To understand the sheer audacity of Henry J. Kaiser's gamble, one must examine the molecular bond of the ships themselves. For centuries, ocean-going vessels were held together by friction and immense physical pressure. Overlapping plates of heavy steel were painstakingly drilled, aligned, and bound by millions of red-hot rivets. It was a proven, virtually indestructible method of shipbuilding, perfected over generations in the storied yards of Britain and the American East Coast. It was also disastrously slow, and overlapping plates required excess steel, a commodity suddenly more precious than gold in a global war economy. Kaiser and the Maritime Commission embraced a process that traditional naval architects viewed with deep, vocal suspicion: arc welding. Instead of overlapping the steel, plates were laid flush against each other. An electric arc, burning at thousands of degrees, melted a consumable electrode, seamlessly fusing two massive steel plates into a single continuous piece of metal. Traditional shipwrights along the River Clyde in Scotland and the established yards of New England openly scoffed at the blueprints. They argued vehemently that a fully welded hull lacked the microscopic flexibility of a riveted ship. Without the slight give that rivets provided, they warned, a rigid welded ship subjected to violent, twisting swells of the North Atlantic. Winter would simply snap in half, but the strategic advantages of welding overrode all conservative warnings. By eliminating the overlapping plates and the dense weight of the rivets themselves, a single Liberty ship saved approximately 600 tons of steel. That was enough raw material to manufacture 30 medium tanks for the frontline armor divisions. Furthermore, welding completely democratized the American labor force. A master riveter required years of grueling apprenticeship to perfect his craft, and there were simply not enough of them left in the country. Conversely, a novice could be taught to weld a straight, watertight seam in a matter of weeks. The coastal shipyards were no longer the exclusive, quiet domain of master craftsmen. They were transformed into sprawling, blindingly bright arenas of unskilled, hyper-efficient labor, illuminated 24 hours a day by the blue-white flash of 10,000 welding torches across the Atlantic. Within the heavily fortified, damp concrete bunkers of the U-boat command headquarters in occupied France, Admiral Karl Dönitz studied the intelligence reports regarding this chaotic new American production strategy. The German Naval High Command, steeped in a rigid, historic culture of engineering perfection, analyzed the intercepted EC-2, SE-1 blueprints and found them almost insultingly primitive. The blunt, untapered bow, the low-powered, antiquated steam engine, and especially the fully welded hull were viewed not as industrial innovations, but as acts of sheer, flailing desperation to the highly trained German analytical mind, Naval. Warfare was a precise mathematical equation, and in early 1942, the numbers heavily favored the Third Reich. Dönitz operated on a strict strategic doctrine known as the Tonnagekrieg, or tonnage war. The objective was never to win grand, set-piece naval battles against Allied warships, but simply to sink merchant vessels faster than the enemy's economy could replace them. Dönitz calculated with cold precision that if his U-boat fleet could destroy roughly 700,000 tons of Allied shipping every single month, the British economy would completely collapse. The island nation would be starved into submission long before the Americans could fully mobilize their vast but dormant industrial base. When reports of the sprawling new Liberty shipyards reached German naval intelligence, the engineers literally laughed at the projected production timelines. They applied their own established, traditional metrics of shipbuilding to the wild American claims. They factored in the standard time required to lay a keel, frame a hull, fit a triple expansion engine, and launch a 10,000-ton vessel. Even allowing for legendary American industrial might, the German analysts confidently concluded that the United States could never launch these welded steel boxes fast enough to offset the devastating, catastrophic losses inflicted by the U-boat. Wolfpacks. The mathematics of the Tonnagekrieg seemed absolutely, unshakably secure. Dönitz assured his submarine commanders that these crude, slow-moving American vessels would merely provide a target-rich environment for his seasoned crews, remaining totally unaware that the fundamental rules of industrial production were being rewritten, relying on an entirely new kind of workforce to break the mathematical certainty of the German siege, the coastal shipyards of California, Oregon, and Washington State did not echo with the traditional brogues of Scottish shipwrights or the seasoned dialects of New England dockworkers. Instead, they hummed with the voices of a completely transformed American demographic. As millions of able-bodied men were drafted into the armed forces and sent overseas, the massive new maritime commission shipyards faced a seemingly insurmountable labor shortage. The solution was as radical as the welded ships themselves. The relentless nationwide recruitment campaign reached deep into the American heartland, pulling in sharecroppers from the Deep South, displaced agricultural workers from the Dust Bowl, shopkeepers, and most crucially, hundreds of thousands of women. They became known collectively in the press as Wendy the Welders, donning heavy leather aprons, thick fire-resistant gloves, and protective visors to step into a brutally demanding, traditionally male-dominated industrial arena. The concept of prefabrication made this massive, rapid mobilization possible. In a legacy shipyard, building a vessel required an encyclopedic knowledge of naval architecture, passed down through years of grueling apprenticeship. But in these sprawling, brightly lit fabrication sheds, a worker did not need to know how to construct an entire ship. They only needed to master a single highly specific task. They learned to weld one continuous 3-foot seam, or operate one specific overhead gantry crane, or cut one exact dimension of half-inch steel plate. It was the absolute distillation of the automotive assembly line, scaled up to manufacture ocean-going leviathans. The shipyards operated 24 hours a day, divided into 3 relentless shifts. At night, the West Coast waterfronts glowed with the eerie blue-white strobe of thousands of welding arcs. Workers assembled these massive, standardized steel blocks like giant geometric puzzles, driven by a patriotic urgency and the constant, deafening roar of riveting hammers and industrial presses. This raw, heavily specialized workforce was producing a ship that many naval purists still considered a glaring tactical liability. The Liberty ship's heavy, reciprocating steam engine pushed the vessel at a maximum speed of just 11 knots. In the unforgiving, lethal arena of the North Atlantic, speed was universally equated with survival. Fast requisition troopships, like the RMS Queen Mary, could outrun submarine pursuit entirely, steaming independently across the ocean without escort. The Liberty ship possessed no such luxury. It was a slow, lumbering, highly visible target. Yet, beneath this apparent vulnerability lay a cold, heavily calculated tactical equilibrium. 11 knots was not an arbitrary, failed metric. It was specifically engineered to match the required cruising speed of a standard transatlantic merchant convoy. If the mass-produced ships were built to be significantly faster, they would outpace their heavily armed escorts, break the protective screen, and become isolated, easy prey. Furthermore, while 11 knots was agonizingly slow for a surface vessel, it was critically faster than a submerged German Type 7 U-boat, which maxed out at roughly 8 knots underwater. To intercept, shadow, and pursue a Liberty ship convoy. A U-boat commander was forced to run on the surface, where his diesel engines could push the submarine to 17 knots. But surfacing was a deadly high-stakes gamble. Operating above the waves stripped the submarine of its primary tactical advantage in visibility. It exposed the German crews to the scanning sweeps of early Allied radar, the sharp eyes of escorting destroyers, and the devastating, sudden attacks of long-range patrol aircraft carrying depth charges. The Liberty ship's seemingly deficient pace was, ironically, the exact mathematical speed required to force the Kriegsmarine out of the depths and into a highly vulnerable position. Armed with only a rudimentary 4-inch deck gun mounted on the stern and a scattering of light anti-aircraft cannons, the crews of these merchant vessels sailed into the freezing gauntlet, knowing their primary defense was simply the sheer number of ships around them. The strategic board was fully set, but the true shockwave of this operation was yet to strike. The sheer volume of this standardized production was about to reach a fever pitch, culminating in an industrial spectacle that would shatter every existing maritime record and push the German submarine fleet past its breaking point. By the late autumn of 1942, the American industrial machine transcends mere mass production. It achieves a state of aggressive, synchronized choreography. The early tentative months of trial and error in the mudflats of California and the Pacific Northwest are over. The sprawling Maritime Commission shipyards are no longer just factories. They are living, breathing organisms of steel and electricity, consuming raw materials at one end and excreting fully functioning 10,000-ton cargo freighters at the other. The original goal was to build a single vessel in 6 months. By mid-1942, the national average plummets to under 40 days. But Henry J. Kaiser, the relentless conductor of this industrial symphony, understands the profound psychological theater of total war. He wants to send a message so loud, so mathematically undeniable, that it will echo through the reinforced concrete walls of the U-boat pens in occupied France. He conceives an industrial stunt, a spectacular, carefully orchestrated demonstration of maximum efficiency, designed to break the spirit of Axis intelligence. The target is a newly assigned Liberty ship, hull number 440, She's named the S. Robert E. Peary. Richmond Shipyard Number 2 in California is selected for the spectacle. For weeks, the massive fabrication sheds quietly stockpile prefabricated components. 250-ton deckhouse sections, colossal double-bottom assemblies, and miles of pre-cut piping are staged with military precision around slipway number 14. Every single welder, crane operator, and rivet catcher knows exactly where they need to be. At exactly 1 minute past midnight on Sunday, November 8, 1942, the keel is laid. What follows is an industrial blitzkrieg. Swarms of workers attack the steel skeleton. There is no waiting, no hesitation. As the massive gantry cranes swing a transverse bulkhead into position, dozens of welders fall upon the seams, their torches fusing the metal before the heavy crane cables even slacken. 3 shifts work continuously, rotating seamlessly under the harsh, unblinking glare of floodlights. Sparks fall like a constant metallic blizzard over the slipway. By the end of the first 24 hours, the massive inner bottom and the lower deck are entirely welded into place. On day 2, the internal bulkheads rise, compartmentalizing the cavernous cargo holds. On day 3, the enormous pre-assembled forward deckhouse is hoisted into the night sky, drifting over the shipyard before being dropped precisely onto the hull. The 2,500 horsepower triple expansion steam engine, weighing over 130 tons, is lowered deep into the engine room, its heavy mounts perfectly aligned. This is not construction. It is a massive, violent puzzle snapping together at terrifying speed. On Thursday, November 12, 1942, the workforce steps back, wiping grease and sweat from their faces. The SS Robert E. Peary rests on the slipway. She is fully painted in wartime. Haze gray, her lifeboats are securely hung in their davits. Her compass is calibrated. The beds in the crew quarters have fresh linens. Down in the dark belly of the engine room, there's already high-pressure steam building in her boilers. From the laying of the keel to the moment her hull slides down the greased ways and crashes into the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. Exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes have passed. It is an absolute staggering triumph of human engineering. The Peary is not a hollow mock-up. She is a fully certified, ocean-going freighter. Within days, she is loaded with millions of pounds of war material and steaming toward the war zone. When the United States Office of War Information broadcasts this achievement on shortwave radio, the transmission is inevitably intercepted by listening posts across the Atlantic. In the dark paneled offices of German naval intelligence in Berlin, analysts stare at the translated reports in complete, stunned disbelief. Initially, they dismiss the broadcast as a clumsy, transparent piece of American propaganda. They assume there has been a critical error in the decryption, perhaps a misplaced decimal point. A massive steel ship built from scratch in under 5 days violates every known law of metallurgy, physics, and traditional naval architecture. But as the weeks pass, corroborating evidence trickles in. Neutral observers in coastal ports, deep cover intelligence assets in the Americas, and eventually, the horrifying visual evidence from the periscopes of the U-boat commanders themselves confirm the impossible. The Americans are not just capable of building a ship in 4 days. They are reliably launching 3 new ships every single day across the nation. Admiral Karl Dönitz and his high command are suddenly forced to confront a terrifying reality. Their mathematical formula for victory is crumbling, and the strategic balance of the Atlantic is about to brutally invert. By the spring of 1943, the bitter, freezing waters of the North Atlantic undergo a massive visible transformation. The solitary, terrifying ocean of the first happy time is gone. In its place, a relentless steel highway emerges. The American industrial miracle has transitioned from a coastal spectacle into a fully deployed strategic weapon. The Liberty ships are no longer trickling out of the shipyards. They are flooding the shipping lanes in massive, heavily escorted convoys spanning dozens of square miles. A German U-boat commander raising his periscope in May 1943 is met with a deeply demoralizing sight. Where he once hunted isolated, vulnerable stragglers, he now sees an unbroken horizon of identical blunt-nosed silhouettes. They plow through the gray swells in perfectly aligned columns. There are dozens of them in a single convoy. Hundreds of them are at sea on any given day. They are carrying Sherman tanks, aviation fuel, millions of tons of sea rations, and the heavy artillery required to crack Fortress Europe. Admiral Karl Dönitz sits in his headquarters, staring at the latest maritime intelligence reports. The meticulously calculated mathematics of his Tannegekrieg are failing in real time. In the first quarter of 1943, the U-boat Wolfpacks achieved terrifying success, sinking nearly 100 ships in the span of a few weeks during the desperate battles around convoys SC-122 and HX-229. The German crews fought with lethal efficiency. They expended their torpedoes, dodged depth charges, and pushed their diesel engines past the red line. They sank a staggering amount of Allied steel. But it does not matter. The graph lines in Berlin have violently crossed. For every single cargo vessel the Kriegsmarine sends to the bottom, American shipyards are launching 3, sometimes 4 replacements. The math is brutal, unforgiving, and entirely one-sided. Dönitz requires his fleet to sink 700,000 tons a month just to break even against British imports. By mid-1943, the United States Maritime Commission is producing over 1 million tons of new shipping every 30 days. The Germans are no longer fighting a naval war. They are trying to drain the ocean with a sieve. The sheer volume of these ugly ducklings creates a catastrophic secondary effect for the German hunters. Because there are so many merchant hulls available, the Allies begin converting some of them into escort carriers. These jeep carriers are simply standard cargo ship hulls fitted with a flat wooden flight deck. They are incredibly cheap to produce. They sail directly in the center of the Liberty ship formations, launching Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighters into the sky. Suddenly, the mid-Atlantic gap, the stretch of ocean previously beyond the reach of land-based Allied aircraft, is permanently closed. The U-boats are stripped of their darkest, safest hunting grounds. When a German submarine surfaces to recharge its batteries, it is immediately spotted by airborne radar. Depth charges rain down from the sky before the crew can even man their anti-aircraft guns. The hunters are abruptly, violently transformed into the hunted dot. Imagine the perspective from the conning tower of a Type 7 U-boat. The hydrophone operator below decks removes his headset in despair. The acoustic signature of the ocean has changed. The rhythmic, heavy thumping of thousands of triple expansion steam engines creates an impenetrable wall of sound underwater. It is the deafening heartbeat of the American assembly line, echoing across the Atlantic abyss. The sheer acoustic volume masks the approach of Allied destroyers, rendering German underwater listening gear almost useless. The psychological toll on the German submariners becomes unbearable. They risk everything to slip past the ring of Allied corvettes. They endure hours of terrifying depth charge barrages, the hull of their submarine groaning under immense pressure, light bulbs shattering, and freezing water spraying through ruptured valves. If they survive the gauntlet, if they finally manage to align their crosshairs and loose a spread of torpedoes, they might see a massive pillar of fire erupt from a stricken Liberty ship. They might watch the welded hull buckle and slip beneath the waves, but the victory is entirely hollow. They know with crushing certainty that before they even return to their concrete pens in Lorient, another identical ship will have already rolled off the slipway in California to replace it. The American industrial output has rendered individual German tactical brilliance completely irrelevant. A highly decorated U-boat ace can execute a flawless nighttime surface attack, sinking 30,000 tons of shipping in a single patrol. And it will not delay the Allied war effort by a single second. The month of May 1943 goes down in German naval history as Black May. The Wolfpack suffer catastrophic, unsustainable casualties. 43 U-boats are destroyed in a single month. The veteran commanders, the highly trained crews who terrorized the shipping lanes for 3 years, are annihilated. Dönitz is forced to issue a humiliating order. He withdraws his surviving submarines from the North Atlantic. The tonnage war is officially lost. The crude, welded steel boxes dismissed by German engineers as structurally doomed have broken the back of the Kriegsmarine. The Liberty ships have flooded the war zone with so much cargo capacity that the German war machine physically chokes on the volume of targets. The massive logistical pipeline to Great Britain is finally secured, and the focus of the war pivots from survival to absolute offense. The retreat of Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat fleet in May 1943 transforms the North Atlantic from a battlefield into a heavily trafficked logistical highway. The American industrial pipeline, once a desperate gamble, is now functioning as a relentless, unstoppable fire hose of materiel. The numbers generated by the United States Maritime Commission begin to defy human comprehension. Before the guns fall silent in 1945, the sprawling coastal shipyards of America will have launched 2,710 Liberty ships. It stands as the largest single class of civilian or military ships ever constructed in the Naval history of human SEAFARING. This staggering armada does not simply save the British Empire from starvation. It fundamentally rewrites the strategic capabilities of the entire Allied war effort. These blunt, ungraceful steel boxes become the primary delivery mechanism for the Lend-Lease program, projecting American industrial power to the farthest, most hostile corners of the globe. In the brutal, freezing expanse of the Barents Sea, Liberty ships form the backbone of the Arctic convoys. Plunging through mountainous, ice-choked swells, they endure weeks of sub-zero temperatures to reach the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The conditions are terrifying. Ice accumulates on the superstructure so rapidly that crews must constantly chip it away with heavy axes to prevent the top-heavy vessels from capsizing. Yet, deep within their cavernous cargo holds, they carry the very lifeblood of the Red Army. They deliver thousands of Studebaker trucks, hundreds of locomotives, millions of pairs of winter boots, and the high-octane aviation fuel necessary to push the Luftwaffe out of the Eastern Front. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin would later raise a toast at the Tehran Conference and bluntly state that without American production, the Allies could never have won the war. The Liberty ship was the undisputed vessel that made that production physically relevant on the battlefield. By the early spring of 1944, the focus shifts to the greatest amphibious invasion in human history. Southern England is transformed into a massive, heavily guarded military warehouse, and the mass-produced freighters are the primary architects of this buildup. The harbors of Liverpool, Southampton, and Portsmouth are choked with identical haze-gray hulls. Their heavy cargo booms swing continuously, day and night. Under a thick canopy of protective barrage balloons, they unload mountains of 155mm artillery shells, thousands of Sherman tanks, and crated P-51 Mustang fighter planes heavily coated in protective grease. Every single bullet, every field dressing, and every ration required to sustain the millions of men preparing for Operation Overlord arrives in the belly of an EC-2 SE-1 when D-Day finally commences on the morning of June 6, 1944. Dozens of Liberty ships are right there in the choppy waters of the English Channel. In the days that follow, some are even deliberately scuttled by their own crews, their mass-produced, welded hulls sunk into the seabed off the coast of Normandy to form the breakwaters of the artificial Mulberry harbors. They prove that even in death, they serve the relentless logistical machinery of the invasion. The triumph of the assembly line is absolute, securing the physical material needed to crush the Axis powers beneath a mountain of steel. Yet, this unprecedented miracle of mass production, built at blinding speed by an eager but inexperienced workforce, harbors a terrifying microscopic flaw deeply embedded within its revolutionary construction. That flaw is the metallurgical phenomenon known as brittle fracture, the steel utilized in the rapid expansion of American shipyards often contained higher than ideal levels of sulfur and phosphorus. In the warm waters of the Pacific or the mild currents of the Gulf Stream, these welded hulls perform admirably, absorbing the stress of the ocean without incident. But when these massive steel boxes plunge into the freezing, sub-zero temperatures of the North Atlantic or the treacherous, ice-choked Arctic routes to Murmansk, the molecular structure of the mass-produced steel fundamentally changes. It loses its elasticity. It becomes dangerously brittle, behaving more like glass than flexible naval armor. Furthermore, the very workforce that made this miracle possible, the armies of newly trained citizens and Wendy the welders, occasionally left microscopic defects in the miles of continuous weld seams. A tiny slag inclusion, a slight undercut, or an imperfectly fused joint. Under normal peacetime conditions, these microscopic imperfections are harmless. But in the violent, freezing storms of the Arctic, subjected to the immense twisting shear stress of a 40-foot ocean swell, a microscopic flaw can instantly become a death sentence, because the Liberty ship is essentially a single, continuously welded piece of metal, unlike a traditional riveted ship where a crack naturally stops. At the edge of an overlapping steel plate, a fracture can travel with terrifying, unimpeded speed. It propagates across the deck and down the side of the hull at the speed of sound. The cinematic reality of this flaw is horrifying. Surviving crews report standing on watch in the freezing darkness and suddenly hearing a deafening noise, like the blast of a heavy artillery cannon echoing from the empty cargo holds. In a matter of seconds, the main deck violently splits open. The square corners of the cargo hatches, acting as massive stress concentrators, simply tear apart. Vessels like the SS John P. Gaines physically rip themselves in half in the freezing swells, violently plunging their crews into the lethal waters without a single German torpedo ever being fired. Out of the 2,710 Liberty ships built, over 1,000 experience some form of brittle fracture. Nearly a dozen break completely in two, lost to the unforgiving physics of the ocean rather than the enemy. The engineers of the Maritime Commission are forced to race against time, implementing emergency crack arresters, heavy riveted steel straps, bolted across the decks of later models to stop a running fracture from splitting the ship. It is a horrifying, deeply sobering price paid for industrial speed. Yet, in the cold, unfeeling calculus of global warfare, it is a mathematically acceptable margin of error. The Allies are losing a fraction of a % of their vast new fleet to structural failure compared to the catastrophic 20% they were losing to German U-boats just 2 years prior. Back in the heavily fortified command centers of Berlin, the architects of the German war machine slowly recognized the totality of their defeat. Minister of Armaments Albert Speer and Admiral Karl Dönitz look at the staggering, undeniable production figures pouring out of the American shipyards. The realization is absolute, and it is paralyzing. The Third Reich had invested its entire national identity in technological supremacy, building the most sophisticated, highly engineered, and complex weapons the world had ever seen. They believed entirely in the doctrine of quality over quantity, but the United States did not answer with quality. They answered with an avalanche of standardized, heavily compromised, good enough quantity. The German engineers who had arrogantly laughed at the crude, boxy blueprints of the Liberty ship failed to comprehend the true nature of the war they had provoked. They failed to understand that Henry J. Kaiser and the Maritime Commission were not trying to build perfect ships. They were building a continuous, unbreakable conveyor belt across the Atlantic Ocean. The Axis powers were not defeated by superior naval tactics or legendary seamanship. They were simply smothered by an industrial avalanche they could neither comprehend nor physically stop, setting the stage for a profound shift in how the world viewed the machinery of conflict. The machinery of conflict had been fundamentally altered, forever shifting the paradigm from artisanal craftsmanship to relentless standardized mass production. When the Second World War finally ended in the late summer of 1945, the oceans of the world were crowded with the boxy, rust-streaked silhouettes of the Liberty ship. They had not been built to endure. They were designed with a cynical, highly calculated life expectancy of just 5 years, meant only to survive long enough to drop their cargo on a hostile shore. Yet, these ugly ducklings refused to fade quietly into the annals of military history. When the guns fell silent, hundreds of surviving vessels were sold at rock-bottom prices to battered, recovering nations. They formed the absolute foundation of the post-war global shipping industry. Greek maritime magnates built entire commercial empires on surplus American steel. Nations physically ruined by years of relentless aerial bombardment relied on these very same slow, lumbering freighters to import the concrete, timber, and steel required to resurrect their shattered cities. In the grand sweeping history of naval architecture, the EC-2 SC-1 will never be remembered for its aesthetic beauty, its tactical speed, or its maritime grace. It possessed absolutely none of these qualities. It was a strictly utilitarian steel box, plagued by the terrifying threat of microscopic flaws, powered by an obsolete, heavy steam engine, and rapidly welded together by farmers, shopkeepers, and women who, in many cases, had never even seen the ocean before they picked up a torch. But perfection is often the fatal enemy of victory. In the darkest, most desperate hours of the 20th century, when the cold mathematics of starvation and survival demanded an immediate miracle, the free world did not require a masterpiece of naval engineering. It required an assembly line. The brilliant, highly trained German engineers who had so arrogantly laughed at those early, crude blueprints failed to realize a crucial truth. They were not looking at a traditional ship. They were looking at a bridge. It was a continuous, heavily reinforced bridge of raw industrial willpower, spanning the freezing expanse of the Atlantic. And it was this remarkably unglamorous, mass-produced bridge that ultimately carried the crushing weight of the Allied war effort all the way to total victory.